Gordonsville, Virginia, 1873. Before the train fully stops, they are already running. Dozens of black women crossing the platform at speed, golden fried chicken stacked on platters, balanced on their heads, biscuits tucked alongside, pies under arms. They have heard the whistle. They know exactly how much time they have. They reach the cars before the doors open, arms raised, food passing through wooden-framed windows, to passengers leaning out with money already in hand. 15 cents for a breast, 15 cents for a leg, a nickel or a dime if you were watching your spending. A journalist riding one of these trains later wrote that the smell reached him before the station came into view. He said there was nothing like it on earth outside of the neighborhood of Gordonsville. These women have no restaurants, no storefronts, no menus. Many cannot read or write. 8 years before this moment, they were legally considered property. Today, they are running the most efficient food operation in the country. The dish they are selling through those windows will, within 100 years, generate more commercial revenue than almost any food product in human history. Drop your city or country in the comments. We want to know where you are watching from, because this story reached every corner of the world in ways most people have never been told. By the time this documentary is over, you will understand exactly how it got there. The history of fried chicken is not really a food story. It is a story about who builds something and who gets credit for building it, and how an entire industry can be raised on a foundation it never fully acknowledged. Some nations have never worked that out. America is still in the middle of trying, and the story begins not in Kentucky, not in a gas station, not anywhere near a white suit or a secret recipe. It begins somewhere far older and far stranger than most people have been told. Ask almost any American where fried chicken comes from, and they will say the South. Ask who invented it, and they will either say Colonel Sanders or shrug, assuming it simply rose from American soil the way jazz did, or blues, or baseball. One of those things a country produces and eventually forgets the labor that went into it. The truth pulls in two directions at once, and neither of them starts in America. The first goes back to medieval Scotland. Scottish cooks had a long-standing tradition of deep-frying chicken pieces in hot fat. Practical, filling, and seasoned with almost nothing. No paprika, no pepper, no herbs of any kind, just fat and bird. The technique was solid. The result was the kind of food you eat because you are hungry, not because you are glad to be alive. In 1773, the Scottish writer James Boswell noted in his diary that he had eaten fried chicken on the Isle of Skye. Scholars consider this the earliest known written Western reference to the dish, a passing line in a travel journal, the kind of detail you record before moving on to something else entirely. While Boswell was writing that diary entry, something very different was developing on the other side of the ocean. Across the coastal regions of West Africa, deep frying had been a common cooking practice for generations. Chicken went into palm oil, came out seasoned, layered with spice profiles built and refined over centuries. This was not simple food. It was the product of accumulated knowledge, passed down through practice rather than through cookbooks, because nobody in the 1700s was publishing the cookbooks of West Africa. That gap in the written record has sometimes been mistaken for a gap in the knowledge itself. It was not. The knowledge was extensive. The people who carried it were simply not considered worth documenting. By the early 1800s, Scottish immigrants had settled across Virginia, the Carolinas, and the broader American South, bringing their frying traditions with them. They arrived into a society built almost entirely on the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans, who had been brought to those same shores carrying everything they knew, which, in the case of food, was considerable. The collision of those two traditions was not a meeting of equals and was never meant to be, but something came out of it that the plantation system had not intended and could not contain. Something new, something that had never existed before. The question of who made it is the question this whole story turns on. Here is something that sounds like a footnote and turns out to be the entire origin. On the plantations of the antebellum South, enslaved people were sometimes allowed to keep chickens. The reason was coldly economic. Chickens were too small to significantly impact a plantation's resources, too cheap to be worth restricting, easy enough to ignore. So enslaved families were permitted small flocks. That permission was a crack in the wall, and through that crack, the cooks walked. These women were not improvising. They were working from a body of culinary knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage, survived the deliberate destruction of African cultural life that the plantation system required, survived everything the country had thrown at it for generations. They took West African spice traditions, the paprika, the pepper, the layered seasoning carried forward in memory, and applied them to the Scottish frying technique that had entered the plantation kitchen alongside European settlers. They seasoned chicken, dropped it into hot fat, and produced something the Scottish original had never come close to being. Worth eating, deeply, specifically, memorably worth eating. The families who owned those plantations noticed immediately. Enslaved women were assigned to the house kitchen not despite their skill, but because of it. The food they created became the food the household served, and because the household was wealthy and well-connected, the food traveled. It moved upward through Southern society, attached to the names and reputations of people who had not made it. In 1824, a Virginia woman named Mary Randolph published a cookbook called The Virginia Housewife. It is the first widely accepted American cookbook to include a fried chicken recipe. Randolph had grown up on a plantation, lived on plantations her entire adult life, and had enslaved people cooking in her kitchens throughout. Her book made her famous. The people whose recipe she published did not receive acknowledgement of any kind. The phrase fried chicken does not even appear in American writing until the 1830s, decades after the dish was already being made regularly. The food existed before the language to describe it. The cooks who built it existed before the credit. Every franchise that would follow, every bucket sold in every country, every dollar this industry would eventually generate, can be traced back to an act of creation performed in a plantation kitchen by women whose names no one thought to record. That is not a footnote to this story. That is its foundation. And what those same women did next, once the system that had confined them finally cracked open, is the part that almost nobody knows. The Civil War ended in 1865. 4 million enslaved people were legally free, and the country that had freed them had made almost no plan for what happened afterward. They needed work, needed income, needed some way to build a life inside an economy that was actively structured to prevent them from doing so. Some of them looked at what they had: cooking knowledge built over generations, access to chickens, and in the case of Gordonsville, Virginia, something that turned out to be worth more than anyone initially realized: location. Gordonsville sat at the junction of two major rail lines, which meant trains passed through constantly, and trains in the 1860s and 1870s carried something passengers desperately wanted and could not find anywhere on board: food. There were no dining cars. If you were traveling by rail in the post-Civil War era and your journey lasted more than an hour, you were hungry. The railroad had no solution to that problem. Most stops had no food available. It was simply an unresolved gap in the system. The women of Gordonsville filled it. When they heard a whistle, they ran. Platters of fried chicken balanced on their heads, moving across the platform at pace, arms extending up through open passenger windows, transactions completed in seconds before the train continued on. They built a tiered pricing structure, a higher rate for breasts and legs, less for backs and wings. They cooked in advance, calibrating volume and portability. This was logistics, not luck. a precision food operation disguised as informal commerce. The reputation spread faster than the railroad did. Passengers began deliberately routing their journeys through Gordonsville specifically for the food. Rail publications wrote about these women with genuine admiration. The town was called the fried chicken capital of the world, and the title was not a marketing claim, it was earned. In 1970, a woman named Isabella Winston, known as Bella, gave an interview to a local newspaper. She was 80 years old. She had worked as a waiter-carrier herself, learning the trade from her mother, who had worked the platforms before her, and she said something that contains more history than most books manage in 100 pages. My mother paid for this place with chicken legs. Not a metaphor, a financial statement. A formerly enslaved woman had converted culinary skill and fried chicken into a mortgage, had built a house, and had passed that trade down to her daughter, who then passed it to hers. The scholar Psyche Williams Forson later named her entire book after it, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs. It is one of the most important works of American food history, written in the last 50 years. Most people have never encountered it. The waiter-carriers operated for decades, from the aftermath of the Civil War through the 1920s, until the railroads finally added dining cars and removed the market gap the women had turned into an industry. Their operation was, in every meaningful sense, the world's first fast food business, mobile, scalable, commercially intentional, and built on consistent quality. If you are watching this and finding yourself thinking about the gap between the history you were taught and the one you are hearing right now, you are not alone. Hit the like button if this is landing the way we hope it is. It genuinely helps this channel keep making documentaries that tell the full story. Now for the part that is harder to sit with. These women were thriving. Some were buying homes. Some had bought their own freedom before the war even ended, using income from fried chicken. They were economically visible, socially visible, building things in a country that had been designed to ensure they had nothing, and that visibility produced a response. Power, when it feels seriously threatened, rarely moves directly. It reaches for something more durable and more damaging than a law or a policy. It reaches for image. It reaches for language. It bends symbols until they mean something they never used to mean, and then it waits for the damage to compound across generations. That is what happened to fried chicken. Beginning in the late 1800s, white performers in blackface appeared on stages across the country performing caricatures of Black Americans. Lazy, slow, childlike, obsessed with cheap food. The foods they chose as props were not random selections. They chose watermelon, which black farmers had turned into a genuine post-emancipation cash crop. They chose fried chicken, the exact dish that black women were selling at train stations and using to purchase homes. The foods of black economic independence were repackaged, deliberately and systematically, as evidence of black primitivism. The same dish that had bought Bella Winston's mother a house was printed onto postcards, stamped onto salt and pepper shakers, worked into sheet music covers and newspaper cartoons distributed nationally, always attached to grotesque caricatures designed to carry a single message: these people are beneath you. In 1915, the filmmaker D.W. Griffith released The Birth of a Nation, and the stereotype reached an audience no minstrel show ever could. The film depicted black legislators eating fried chicken chaotically inside government chambers. The visual argument being that black Americans were fundamentally unfit for the civic rights they had just been granted. The Birth of a Nation screened at the White House. President Woodrow Wilson reportedly praised it. The Ku Klux Klan used it as a recruitment film. The timing is the evidence. The racist fried chicken stereotype did not emerge from casual observation. It escalated precisely as black economic power grew. The Gordonsville women were thriving. Black-owned businesses were forming. The response was not law enforcement or economic competition. It was a cultural campaign designed to associate black success with primitivism, to make the food itself feel like proof of inferiority rather than evidence of genius. The food that bought a house became a weapon used against the people who built it. And none of that stopped fried chicken from moving forward. The dish had too much momentum, too much genuine appeal, too much of what people were willing to cross a county or reroute a train for. What changed was who got to profit from it publicly, who got to put a name on it, who got to become the face of it. Enter a man named Harlan Sanders. Sanders was born in 1890 in Henryville, Indiana. His father died when he was 6. His mother went to work at a cannery. Harlan stayed home and cooked for his younger siblings because she had shown him how before necessity took her away. He left school in 7th grade and spent the next 30 years accumulating failures at a rate that would have stopped most people much earlier. He faked his age to enlist in the Army at 16, was discharged a year later, got hired by the railroad, got fired for fighting with a coworker, built a legal practice, ended it in another fight, ran a ferryboat company, manufactured acetylene lamps, opened gas stations that did not survive. By 1930, he was 40 years old and running a service station in Corbin, Kentucky, and for reasons that had more to do with necessity than vision, he started feeding the truck drivers who stopped there. The chicken was good. Word moved the way good chicken always does. He expanded the station into a restaurant seating over 100 people, and in 1935, the governor of Kentucky bestowed on him an honorary civilian title, Kentucky Colonel. Sanders looked at that title and saw something no one else had thought to see in it. He built a character around it. The white linen suit, the black string tie, the carefully groomed goatee, worn every time he stepped outside. He understood, before the language existed to describe it, that in the modern economy, the person could become the product. He was not selling chicken, he was selling the kernel. By the early 1940s, he had worked out his blend of 11 herbs and spices, and more importantly, figured out how to use a pressure cooker to fry chicken at commercial speed without sacrificing the crust. That second innovation is the one that built the empire. Consistent quality at volume, fast enough to run as a franchise. Without the pressure cooker method, the business that followed could not have existed in the form it took. Then the highway came. The government rerouted a major road away from Corbin. Overnight, the customers he had built a restaurant for simply stopped passing through. He sold the business. He was 62 years old and had almost nothing. 3 years after that, he was 65, living on $105 a month in Social Security, and he made a decision that most people his age, in his situation, would not have made. He loaded his pressure cooker and his recipe into his 1946 Ford and started driving across America. His pitch to every restaurant owner willing to give him a few minutes: let me cook my chicken in your kitchen, teach your people my method, and for every piece you sell using my recipe, you pay me 5 cents. The number most often cited is that he was rejected 1,009 times before anyone agreed. That figure may have been shaped by the retelling over decades. What is certain is that he drove for years, slept in the car, cooked in other people's kitchens, and kept going after every no. The first yes came in 1952 from a restaurateur named Pete Harmon in Salt Lake City, Utah. The agreement was a handshake. Harmon coined the name Kentucky Fried Chicken. By 1963, there were 600 locations, including outlets in Canada, the United Kingdom, Mexico, and Jamaica. Sanders was 66 and had built the largest fried chicken operation in the world. In 1964, he sold it, $2 million. He was 73. Now here is the part that almost never makes it into the story. After the sale, Sanders became one of the company's loudest critics. He called their gravy wallpaper paste, said it publicly and repeatedly. He told journalists the food quality had collapsed and that the standards he had built were being abandoned. He filed lawsuits against KFC. He attempted to launch a competing operation. The most globally recognized face in fried chicken history spent his final years in an active legal and commercial war against the company named after him. One more thing worth knowing. The red and white striped bucket that the entire world associates with KFC was not Sanders' creation. It was developed in 1957 by a young restaurant manager named Dave Thomas, who later founded Wendy's. The visual icon of Colonel Sanders, the bucket, the brand, the image on 100 million pieces of packaging, was assembled from parts that were not entirely his. Given everything this story has established about who builds things and who gets the credit, that detail lands differently than it might have at the start of this documentary. But fried chicken, characteristically, did not wait for anyone to resolve that contradiction. While Sanders was still building his franchise network in the American South, a war had broken out on the other side of the world, and the soldiers sent to fight it were about to carry something with them that nobody had planned for. The Korean War began in 1950. Among the American troops deployed to the peninsula were tens of thousands of African American servicemen fighting in a military that had only just been formally desegregated 2 years earlier. They brought their food culture with them, the way people always carry the tastes of home into unfamiliar places. Korean cooks and food vendors encountered American fried chicken and found it interesting enough to work with. They had their own frying traditions, built on soy, garlic, and fermented pepper paste, their own instincts about texture and heat, and they began to adapt. The technique they developed was technically distinct from anything the American South had produced. Korean chefs fried the chicken twice. The first fry cooked the meat through. The second, at higher heat, drove out residual moisture and produced a crust dramatically thinner and more shattering than the American original, one that stayed crisp long enough to hold up to heavy saucing without collapsing. By the 1970s, Korean fried chicken was a genuine national institution. By the 2000s, it was in London, New York, Sydney, and Paris. American chefs adopted the double frying technique. The dish that African American soldiers had carried to Korea in their food memories had come back to America technically improved, commercially potent, and attached to an entirely new cultural experience. A food built in a plantation kitchen, scaled in a Kentucky gas station, and industrialized by multinational corporations, had been taken apart, refined, and returned in a form that made the original feel like a first draft. At the same time, a version of fried chicken that had been sitting quietly in Nashville, Tennessee for decades was about to introduce itself to the rest of the world under its own terms. The origin story of Nashville hot chicken may be legend, and the people who tell it are honest about that. The version that has been passed down goes like this. Sometime in the 1930s, a man named Thornton Prince came home late one too many times, and someone in his household loaded his fried chicken breakfast with enough cayenne to make a point. The precise intent of what followed is lost in the retelling. What is documented is that Prince loved the result and eventually built a restaurant around it. Prince's Hot Chicken Shack became a Nashville institution for decades, beloved by locals, invisible to everywhere else. By the early 2020s, Nashville Hot Chicken had signed six-figure commercial leases in cities that had never heard of Prince's Shack a decade before. The secret had escaped. And then, a tweet changed everything. On August 19, 2019, Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen posted a single response to Chick-fil-A. Short, pointed, the kind of thing that gets screenshotted and shared before the marketing team has finished their coffee. Within 2 weeks, the Popeye's chicken sandwich had sold out nationwide. Lines wrapped around buildings. People waited hours. Arguments broke out in parking lots. Popeye's staff worked through the night in stores that could not keep up with demand that had no historical reference point. Every major fast food chain that had not yet committed to a chicken sandwich began developing one immediately. The chicken sandwich wars, as it became known, drove genuine product innovation across the entire category and reframed fried chicken as the defining commercial battlefield of American fast food. In the years that followed, while the broader quick-service restaurant industry saw declining traffic, chicken restaurant visits climbed 15% between 2019 and 2025. System-wide sales for chicken restaurant concepts in the United States now exceed $52 billion annually. Chicken restaurant locations grew in 2024 at nearly triple the rate of the overall restaurant industry. If you have made it this far, and you are finding this story as remarkable as we do, subscribe before the next section. What comes next is the part that ties everything together, and it starts back where this documentary began. Popeyes itself was founded in 1972 by Al Copeland, a New Orleans entrepreneur who wanted Cajun-spiced, Louisiana-rooted chicken, which is to say, he wanted the food to carry actual flavor, actual heat, actual cultural weight. He built the chain as a deliberate challenge to what KFC had become by then: standardized, corporate, stripped of the regional character that had made fried chicken worth eating in the first place. Copeland went bankrupt in 1991, having taken on nearly $400 million in debt, expanding too fast. The company was restructured and eventually sold to Restaurant Brands International, the same conglomerate that owns Burger King. The Cajun-born chicken chain became a multinational asset. Copeland died in 2008. The tweet that made his brand famous was written 11 years after he was gone. The $52 billion industry that has grown up around this dish has never answered, in any fully satisfying way, the most basic question the whole story raises. Whose food is this, exactly? KFC operates in 145 countries. Korean fried chicken concepts have expanded across Europe and North America. Nashville hot chicken is now a national category. The double frying method developed in South Korea is standard practice in kitchens that consider themselves premium. And the women who ran to the train platforms in Gordonsville with platters balanced on their heads have no chains named after them. The enslaved cooks who invented the flavor profile that made all of this worth having are absent from every brand story, every franchise prospectus, every logo ever designed. The cultural tradition that built this dish from nothing under conditions that were designed to prevent exactly that kind of building has been credited selectively, incompletely, and mostly by scholars whose books most people will never read. Gordonsville, Virginia, still holds a festival every year celebrating the waiter carriers. Local families gather, compete, cook. The tradition those women established, the one that made a small railroad junction the fried chicken capital of the world before Colonel Sanders was born, lives on in the families of the people who started it. Bella Winston was 80 years old when she gave that newspaper interview. Her mother had worked the platforms. Bella had learned the trade from her. The house her mother bought with her earnings was still standing when Bella spoke. "My mother paid for this place with chicken legs." That sentence is not a quote about food. It is a record of what a person can build when she refuses to accept the limits placed on her, using the only materials available inside a system that was never designed to let her succeed. The dish itself traveled a remarkable distance to reach this moment. It came from the palm oil traditions of the West African coast and the fat-rendered fritters of medieval Scotland. It crossed the Atlantic in the memories of people who were given no choice about the crossing. It was transformed in plantation kitchens by women whose names no one bothered to write down. It was sold through open train windows by women who ran toward the sound of a whistle because the whistle meant income, and income meant something real in a world that was otherwise closed to them. It was mocked by people who understood, on some level, that what those women had built was powerful enough to be threatening. It was scaled by a man in a white suit who drove across America in a used Ford. and refused to stop being told no. It was refined by Korean cooks and returned to America improved. It was ignited by a single tweet and turned into a $52 billion argument that is still going. And through all of it, the creative act at the center, the actual invention of the flavor, the application of centuries of culinary knowledge under conditions of enslavement, remained almost invisible in the public telling. Understanding where something comes from does not change what it tastes like, but it changes what you are tasting in the sense that it changes what you know while you are eating it. History has a way of living inside things, and fried chicken is not an exception. Every piece of it, in every form it has taken on every continent it has reached, carries forward what those unnamed women made in the early 1800s. The franchise industry has not fully reckoned with that lineage. The $52 billion has not fully reckoned with it either. But Bella Winston reckoned with it. In a single sentence, in 1970, in a small-town newspaper that most people have never read, she gave a complete account of everything. The story is still moving. It is moving through food trucks and boardrooms and Korean fried chicken bars and Nashville restaurants with 4-hour waits and every version of this dish that exists in every country where it has taken hold. The arguments about who owns it, who gets to define it, whose story is embedded in it, those arguments are not settled. But the foundation was built a long time ago in a plantation kitchen in Virginia by women who had nothing except skill, memory, and the decision to run toward a sound instead of away from it. They built something that fed a country, crossed oceans, and became an industry worth more than most people can picture. They built it with chicken legs,